Hello YouTube, Manny Beal here. Now I will take a little stab at an old video by Stefan Molyneux about UPB called Ethics Redux, Universally Preferable Behavior Revisited. And let's go.
Well, I found it very useful to analogize UPB compared to science.
Well, that's a small intro that I jumped over, so we are going direct into his comparison with science. The problem is that UPB is proven using deductive syllogisms that also are deeply incorrect. Look at my deconstruction part 11. And science is an inductive reasoning. So you can't combine UPB and science. And traditionally through time, morality and science has been disconnected. So it is kind of unbelievable that Stefan Molyneux can just wander around claiming having combined science and ethics in this way. Either science is violated or ethics is violated. It can't be combined, and particularly not when the proof, or at least one of the proofs for ethics or his UPB is made using deductive reasoning. So I can't see how it works. So
UPB is both a framework for evaluating moral propositions and the actual evaluations. And I'm sorry that I didn't make that more clear in the book, tidying it up now. In the same way, we look at the word science and we understand that it includes both the scientific method and the actual experimentation and pursuits of truth within the scientific method. So science is both a methodology and
science doesn't create truth. That's a fallacy. That's incorrect. That's not what science does. Science is based on truth, you can say. It's based on knowledge, right? But when you experience something and you call it true, you can claim that it's knowledge, and you can use that knowledge to perform science. But science doesn't create truth afterwards. It creates some results according to the system of science, but that's not true. That's interpretations of what is going on, right? Science doesn't create a cow, right? Science doesn't create a fence, right? You may have some systems or things that the way of thinking about how to build it and so on, but that's not science that builds it. It's science that is used as a method rather than objectifying things. So truth helps objectify things.
And individual tests, and the same goes for UPB. UPB evaluates theories, not actions or thoughts.
Well, that's a big problem, as I pointed out several times, that it is actually actions that can be moral or immoral, or whatever way you want to put it with regards to morality. It is not that I'm sleeping that can be immoral or moral. It can be the where I sleep, how I sleep, when I sleep, in what bed I sleep. I mean, these are the things that must be referenced in order for someone use. I know that it's a framework for evaluating theories, but that theory, that if a moral principle has to do somehow with actions in some way or another, then if that is a part of a moral principle, that thing that checks whether or not it's a valid moral principle must also be able to check actions, but it can't do that if it only refers to behaviors. So there's something missing in this moral framework from the sort of the get-go, right?
As in, guy shoots other guys, is that right or wrong? Well, that's an action, and UPB can only evaluate theories that claim universality, of course, which is what ethical theories should do. It's like saying rock falls down, scientific or not. Well, science doesn't evaluate a rock falling down, but only a theory that would describe all rocks. UPB does not mean universally preferred behavior, because some people will say, well, everybody thinks that murder is wrong generally, but some guys still murder, therefore not everyone prefers to not murder, therefore UPB is invalid. But it's preferable, not preferred. It doesn't empirically describe what people already prefer, but a theoretical examination of what people should prefer universally. Now, early on in the book, I provide a number of arguments as to why.
Now, this thing with preference or preferable and so on, I have a really hard time with, right? Because the proof is that people tend to prefer something rather than something else. And preferable apparently is something that somebody or something or that moral principle you are going to create will somehow convince you what you should prefer. But preference is based on liking something, as far as I can understand from UPB or the proof of UPB. And liking something is not something you can tell yourself, oh, now I'm going to like, whatever it is, right? It's just how your body and your mind functions. You can't tell yourself to like something. And if preferable is based on liking something as opposed to something else, well, how do you tell yourself what you should prefer then, right? And not to talk about telling others what they should prefer, right? So I don't really get it.
There is evidence for universally preferable behavior, some biological, some cultural, some philosophical, and people have found some issues with those, which is perfectly fine. But it's important to understand that if there is an issue with one of those arguments, it just means that that proof or that example of the existence of UPB in the world is invalid. It doesn't invalidate UPB. In fact, it validates UPB by saying that logic and proof are universally valuable and valid. If you show that rocks fall, it doesn't prove any particular theory of gravity, right? So I'm just showing the evidence for UPB in the world. It's not the proof of the theory itself. And what drives people a little batty, and it takes a little while to wrap your head around,
that's for sure. It's impossible to argue against UPB without using UPB. That's a argument from hell, right? No argument has that attribute, right? Has that ability, has that power. I mean, I can't make any argument that is constructed that way that if you try to argue against it, you prove my argument. I mean, my argument itself has to be that which shows it. It's not that somebody else starts to argue or make sounds with his mouth or her mouth that suddenly proves ethics, right? It just doesn't work, right? It may sound like there's something there, but it can't be there, right? There's made an analogy is that if somebody proposes that he or she can move the sun out of the solar system, right? And I wrote some kind of treatise or something that describes how that is done. But when you read the treatise, it's like, I'm not sure what the hell it says. And then it says, well, if you argue against this, you prove that I can move the sun out of the solar system. I mean, I'm not going to believe that, right? I'm not going to believe that. And another spin-off it creates is that the guy who wrote it will never want anybody to debate him. Or maybe he wants them to debate him, but as soon as they start to debate him about this particular argument, he says, look, you can stop now, you made your argument, and now you've proven I don't have to listen to you anymore, right? So you can never get to tell him if there's something wrong, because he will always think that he's right because you start to argue with him. So it's sort of it has become some kind of beyond a point of no return or something like that. I don't know exactly how to describe that, but let's see.
Is that it really is impossible to argue against UPB without using UPB. So if somebody says, well, UPB is invalid, and they're saying it's universally preferable to deny theories that are invalid, which is a UPB principle, right? It's either opinion or it's a universal principle. If it's opinion, then it's irrelevant to philosophy. I like ice cream is not a philosophical statement. But if it is ice cream contains dairy, then that is a testable and universal statement. So you can't argue against UPB without using UPB. It's really, really important to understand that.
One way to refute it might be that my argument is basically an action. It's a sound I make with my mouth. I create an action in the world that is the sound waves or whatever you want to call it, that is then received as sound in somebody's mind. But UPB refers to behavior. And behavior is an interpretation of the sound, right? And an interpretation of the sound is not that it is an argument, but the interpretation is that which the sound refers to, right? Like cow or something like that, right? It's not that the cow is a part of an argument, but the reference of the action that is the spoken word is that it refers to an object, which is what you want to do. You want to refer to an object because it's objects that, or the surroundings or whatever you want to call it, that is the situation in which the use of morality is needed. So there's the discrepancy there between actions and behaviors, and I think that's where the hole in the argument is.
Yeah, so if you say UPB doesn't exist, then you're saying it is universally preferable to not believe in universally preferable theories or behaviors, and therefore that's not valid. Now, there are three main categories of actions in the UPB framework. So there's morally neutral actions, such as taking a walk, which has no moral content.
Now, but is that before or after you have to distinguish before? Okay, now we have created the framework. Now we are in the realm of applying it to moral principles or moral statements or whatever it is you are referring to. So are you now categorizing moral statements into morally neutral, aesthetically preferable, and universally preferable, or whatever? Because that's not exactly clear to me whether or not you are before or after the creation of the UPB method.
There are aesthetically preferable actions, such as telling the truth, being on time, politeness, things that are aesthetically preferable, but they can be evaded and they're not inflicted through the initiation of force, right? So if somebody's late continually when they meet you, they're not actually inflicting that on you violently. You can escape that by simply not meeting the person or whatever. But universally preferable behavior, such as the non-aggression principle and the respect for property rights, these cannot be evaded and are inflicted. So if somebody violates the non-aggression principle and runs at you with a knife and stabs you, you can't evade that, and they are violently inflicting that behavior upon you. As
I remember it, these things were not a part of the proof. These distinctions were not. I may be mistaken. It's a big mouthful. Okay, but so you have to categorize these things before you run it through UPB. It sounds like it, because otherwise you would just have to come with your moral principle, run it through, and it will just automatically fall out of these categories. So now you have to analyze your moral principles into at least three categories before you run it through. So that is that sounds to me like a weakness in UPB, that you have to precondition what you have made before you. It's like if you have a vacuum cleaner, but you have to push all the the dust up in the tube manually. Then why would I need a vacuum cleaner then, right?
They are if they steal your property and so on. And so UPB is really focusing on this latter category, though the other categories are not unimportant, but it's important to distinguish this latter category as the real center of the most important aspect of ethics. So let's throw this into a grid. Morally neutral.
I think we will jump over this.
You can do something. You can go for a walk. You can. Capable impossibilities and contradictions, which is why we know it's invalid. So Bob and a theory that murder is universally preferable behavior, that to murder is universally preferable behavior, is what everybody must do. Unfortunately, murder as UPB leads to inescapable impossibilities and contradictions, which is why we know it's invalid.
Yeah, but there's a problem with these terms, murder, because murder is a term for an occurrence or some object that is already imbued with something that is immoral. The problem is that you're sort of this way smuggling morality in through the back door by using terms that are already morally loaded, and then not pointing out that that is what you're doing. You know, you should write killing, and killing under these circumstances with these attributes is when it becomes murder, right? Another point is that murder is something that is described after a moral principle should have been applied, right? It's not a murder happened and now we apply the moral principle, right? Then it's too late. It should be applied before the murder occurs so that it won't occur, preferably, hopefully, right? So murder is on the other side, right? It's like, I don't know, like saying, I'm going to play golf after I have played 18 rounds to better my whatever. But then it's after the fact, it's after the round, it's after the game has been done, right? So you're not playing anymore now, right? So that you're not playing the morality game when the murder has occurred. So yes, it's murder exactly because morality wasn't applied, but now it's a murder. So you can't change anything with morality because it's too late. So murder is not something you can use in any case.
So Bob and Doug are immoral until the moment of murder, because if murder is UPB, then the opposite of murder, which is not murdering, cannot be UPB as well. A thing and its opposite can't both be in the same category, right? So then Bob and Doug are immoral, or you could say at least amoral, until the moment of murder. And they're moral then only in the moment of murdering each other. And that really does seem to offend our logical sensibilities quite a bit. They cannot both be moral at the same time because they can't both simultaneously strangle each other at the same time and die at the same time.
Well, why do they need to be strangling each other? You're talking about behaviors. So any behavior that leads to killing is useful, can be considered in this context, right? So one could be stabbing one in the stomach while the other is trying to, strangle. So it doesn't have a stealing. I could be stealing your wallet while you steal my iPhone. It's both stealing, right? It doesn't have to be the same object that goes back and forth, right?
They'll continue to strangle, right? So they can't both be moral at the same time, which doesn't really seem to make much sense. But interestingly enough, they must also resist being killed, because it's not murder if you want to be killed, right? So they have to say that murder...
No, but there's a problem there. You don't know what people want. You don't have access to their minds. It's a problem of other minds. So you can't know what they think about this action. You can't point to say, this is a murder because that person there who is dying or being dead does not want that to occur. You can't. You can theorize about it and say, I presume that's the case, but you can't know it, right? You don't know what's going on in that mind. I mean, I know it's sort of a borderline kind of sounds a case where somebody has a knife in somebody's heart. They probably don't want that knife to be there. I would agree with that, of course. But if your argument is that you're implicitly saying that you know that that person don't want it, but that would mean that you had access to their wanting or not. You don't have that, so you can't use it as an argument. You have to formulate in another way, right?
Murder is universally preferable behavior, but I must also resist being murdered so that the other person's actions fall into the category of murder. Thus, you must oppose that which is universally preferable, which is an inescapable contradiction. We sort of understand that, right? Like if you get a Wikipedia thing, if you get a MapQuest thing saying go north and south at the same time, you understand that's a contradiction. So murder as UPB is a contradiction, simply can't work. And the same goes for rape and theft. And these simply can't be universally preferable behavior. And I go into that in the book in these particular examples. And I think that's a really valuable way of looking at this. So UPB is evaluating that murder is universally preferable behavior and finding it to be an impossible theory, rife with self-contradiction and impossibilities, and therefore is invalid. Now, something else that I mentioned in the book is the Coma Test. And the Coma Test is we can generally understand that a man in a coma can't be considered evil or immoral. So
why not really? I mean, evil, that's a sort of a strong religiously, with religious connotations, right? If you're promised somebody to do something and you end up in a coma when you should have done that, it might not be your fault, but you're still responsible for that thing that you cannot do because you ended up in a coma, right? So it's not that clearly cut, in my opinion. No, I wouldn't say he should be shot or anything like that because he ended up in a coma. He probably wanted to do whatever it was, but because of the coma, he's not going to do it. But still, it doesn't necessarily, invalidate all morality, like puff in a cloud of smoke. I'm sorry, I am not very good in this evening, expressing myself for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Chosen positive obligations fail the Coma Test, which is if they apply to a man in a coma and render him evil, then there's something wrong with them for sure. So if we say it is our moral duty to help all llamas, a guy in a coma can't help a llama. We must pay our taxes. Well, a guy in a coma is not paying a tax. And so these are unchosen positive obligations. And they really, again, this is not a complete proof, but it's a good sort of rule of thumb for starting to find out where problems may exist in an ethical theory. And children are a chosen positive obligation, right? So you have kids, then you kind of have created an obligation within yourself.
Yes. I actually like that one, the last one. Children are chosen positive obligation. This is one of those corners of UPB I actually really like, because it seems to me that no philosophers and no one in the whole world talking ethics ever talk about children. But they're the ones growing up to become some of those people who have to, work with some kind of moral principle, possibly, right? But they can't be responsible for morality that they don't understand or cannot apply or whatever it is. So those people who are responsible for their existence must be those who are responsible for their, let's say, ethical behavior until that time comes when they sort of can do it on their own. Let's put it that way. So I really like that one. That's a good one. Thumbs up.
Like if you have a pet, you have to feed the pet. Otherwise, the pet's going to starve, or you lock the pet in the basement. So let's get this question about children. And by the by, thank you so much for the people who have been sending in questions and comments and criticisms. They've been really, really helpful in helping me to understand where the theory is harder to understand and hopefully make things clearer, as in this presentation.
But they didn't find any flaws in it. They didn't find a single flaw anywhere. I have pointed out a smorgasbord of flaws and misconceptions and equivocations, equations, and all sorts of weird structures in your philosophy. Nobody has pointed that out, any of that. It's just like, well, I want you to explain this. It doesn't sound, plausible to me, right? Or your listeners are afraid of telling you the truth.
So some objections. Well, the inevitable lifeboat scenarios. Do we
Yeah. These are
kill 5 people?
Do
you cannibalize someone in the lifeboat,
trolley problem, all that bullshit.
All of these situations never going to happen to me, for honesty. So there's a near universal plague of a lack of understanding of the universality of ethics, particularly by people who are no longer religious, who aren't religious. So in a time of near universal plague, doctors like us, right, philosophers, thinkers, who possess effective medicine, get together to discuss everything but the actual plague and getting the medicine into the hands of the people who need it most. So it's like, they're all getting together and say, how could we best treat a man who's having a heart attack and is diabetic and he's got an arrow through his eye and psychotic and lemmings are chewing their way through his nipples and he's got hoofs for hands and so on. Well, this is stuff that as doctors, metaphorically, we're just never going to encounter. So I think that we have much more pressing work to do than endless examination of extreme life scenarios.
I don't like that we thing. We have something to do. No. There's no we here. Don't say we. Train yourself to say I, right? There's no we. We have no agreement that we are going to do something in a sort of collective or any agreement. We don't have that. We don't have that. Now, sorry, I'm using we, but you're referring to we, so I have referred to the we you're referring to. So I am training myself to constantly think as I rather than we, because if you don't have an agreement with somebody else, there is no we, right? That's only you, meaning I from the first person perspective.
So we're never going to encounter, but again, they're useful tests for theories in some ways. So I may be a little impatient with them, but let's have a look at one that came up a while back. So respect for property rights is a problem. Really, it's one than it's a life jacket from some dude's boat and throw it to a drowning woman. Am I stealing his life jacket? If I perform
all that, we don't want to waste time on that.
I'll save that woman. What a great cutback, rather than air for different. Here's another one that comes up quite a lot: lying and guns. Right? So people say, well, UPB says that lying is wrong. It's not an APA, right?
Lying is wrong? No, you but you can't know if people are lying because you do not have access to their minds. It's a correlation. It's a comparison, was the word I was looking for, between what they experience and what they claim in a proposition, right? That's a cow. And if they say it's false, well, you have no way of knowing whether or not there's a cow in their mind. So you can't know if they're lying. And other people can't know if you're lying either, right? So lying is not something you can attach any kind of morality to, right? And lying is not a part of science. I mean, can you use the scientific method on lying? And you are equating UPB with science and so on. It doesn't work, right? That doesn't work. And if people want to lie, it's their business, right? If they need to lie, in some way you have to respect that because they think that lying is the best strategy at that moment when they're lying. Well, it's a sort of an old artifact of religious or a Christian thinking, right? Lying. Who gives a shit what people think? If they lie, so what? It will possibly end up to their own detriment anyway if they're lying about something they shouldn't be lying about, right? So it's up to you to figure out whether or not they're lying by some kind of judgment, right? But it's a subjective judgment about the person or how virtuous you believe they are. And if you think they're lying, don't interact with them. That's how you stop them lying, instead of trying to force them to tell the truth, right? If you think they're lying, so I think you're lying. I don't want to work with you, right? So that's how it should be, in my opinion, that you Avoid those people you don't want to interact with. And then they lose some interaction, which makes their life less good. And that will improve their behavior or their actions, right? It will improve it, so they stop lying and become better people. And that's what you want. You want to sort of a long-term convergence towards sort of, quote, preferable behaviors. So
in other words, lying cannot be universally applied, but it's not inflicted on others in the same way that like murder. Lies can be avoided in a way that murderers cannot be. So people say, well, UPB says lying is wrong, but we would all lie to someone who demanded to know where our spouse was so that they could go and kill him or her. And therefore it's a contradiction, because lying is wrong, but then it's right in this situation, and therefore UPB fails. Well, there are some pretty obvious hierarchies in UPB, APA and UPB being the two that are the most important. So UPB trumps APA, for sure. And remember, it's the difference between initiation and retaliation. Right, so going shooting a guy in the kneecaps is wrong because you're initiating force. But if a guy's running at you with a chainsaw,
no. Now you're just talking about all sorts of actions. No, you're shooting in the knee. That's at least very close to an action. You can talk about that because it says universal behavior, right? It's behavior. Don't talk about actions. Your system doesn't cover actions. So you can't talk about it. It's bullshit, right?
Then you can shoot him in the kneecaps because self-defense, right? So,
and also you must constantly refer to that principle which you have run through UPB. Don't talk about this person lies and that person lies and this person shoot there and that person shoot there or whatever. That's a description of what is going on. That is not a description of how to apply the principle. What happens in the world is that's not ethics, right? What happens in the world is the general nature of what is happening is a result of how that moral principle was applied. So it sort of converges to something that is better than it was previously from some kind of idea of what that ethics is supposed to do, right? So you must have some principle that you're using. That's what you must, okay, now I have this principle that I have found that it works. I think it checks out with UPB, and now I'm applying it here, and now I'm applying it here, and now I'm applying it here. Don't talk about specific incidents, because you have to apply that principle that you have found using UPB to adjust to that. If it's necessary, if it hasn't already gone bad, so to say.
It's response versus initiation, right? That's really, really important. UPB doesn't say violence is wrong. The non-aggression principles, the initiation of the use of force is wrong. So in this typical scenario, we have, some spiky-haired, Dallas anarchic brother who's got some kind of gun, and he's holding it to the head of some dude saying, where's your cute wife? Hey, she's winking at me, how nice. And so he's pointing a gun at the guy saying, where's your wife? I want to go and kill her. And the guy says, haha, my hair is too perfect for me to tell you. I will not tell you. I will lie and say that she's in Timbuktu. But so the question is, well, what's the moral dilemma here? This is what people focus on. There's a moral dilemma for the guy. Should he tell the truth or not? Is lying right or wrong? And I would sort of submit that it's sort of missing the point of the example, right? The point of the example is this thing on the left here, right? The point of the example is that there's a guy with a gun to your head, right? That's the initiation of force. And it wouldn't make much sense to say, I'm morally allowed to shoot the guy in the kneecaps who's got a gun to my head, but I'm not allowed to tell him a white lie to save my wife, right? Because it's a response to the situation, not the initiation. And if we're going to focus on the ethics of the situation, we really need to focus on the gun, not on the falsehood that's told by the guy with a gun to his head. So.
No, but that's the problem here, what's it called? A gray area, whatever. That the gun is there possibly because a moral principle wasn't used, or a perfect or a very good moral principle wasn't in use. So somebody ended up with a gun to somebody else's head, right? So this is possibly one of those situations where that principle should have been applied before, or maybe before that and before that and before that, and back in somebody's childhood or whatever, right? So there's a lot of situation in sort of in present time that is a result of a long line of a lack of application of a perfect moral principle. So it's difficult to say, well, okay, now I have a principle, and then people will say, well, how should it treat this situation and that situation and this situation, that situation? Well, that's not how you should judge the moral principle. You should judge if that moral principle had been in use for 3 generations or something like that. How would the world look then, right? That's the sort of the idea of the functionality of the principle, not some guy having a gun to somebody else's head, right?
I think that works. UPB trumps APA. That which cannot be avoided trumps that which can be avoided. You can't avoid the gun to your head. You can't avoid the liar. And as I mentioned, immoral actions, quote, immoral actions are perfectly permissible in self-defense, right? Shooting some guy in the knee.
It's just weird, because are you referring to a principle now? What's the principle that you have? I mean, UPB is a framework for checking principles, let's call it that. So have you checked in with a principle now and you're using that? Or are you just talking on various situations where you think UPB will, but that's not what UPB should do, right? So how does it actually work, this thing you call UPB? Are you just sort of putting it on, actions here, there? But you shouldn't do that, because it's about behaviors and it's about checking moral statements. But are you saying to me that instead of having a principle that you follow, you have the UPB that checks every single situation possible? Because then you have to run through, 20 pages of UPB, and that won't work, right? That's obvious. It's so obvious, it's ridiculous, right?
Telling a falsehood or whatever. If it's a self-defense situation, then these things are, if a guy said, well, I don't want to tell a lie, so here's where my wife is, we'd all get that wasn't a particularly good action. And UPB, I think, explains very well why that is the case. And with the lifeboat scenarios, immoral actions are permissible if it is reasonable to expect permission afterwards, right? Taking the guy's life jacket.
No, you shouldn't say immoral action are permissible, because then somebody will create a situation where they will say, well, it's permissible to be immoral here because I say so, and because this and that or the other, right? No, that doesn't work. You should say if people break a moral principle, you should say, well, okay, you broke the moral principle. There are no escapes. There are no exit clauses or any loopholes. It's not that instead of trying to make an exception from the rule to make sure that it doesn't look like the rule is not being applied, then just say that there's somebody here who didn't follow the rule. It's much closer to what is really going on. I mean, if people don't want to do it, well, fine. You actually want people to break the rule, so you have an idea who breaking the rule, and let them start in the small areas, like paying 10% less than they should, or whatever, instead of ending up throwing nuclear bombs or something like that, right? So you want people to be close to the limits of morality, to see if they constantly are on that borderline, because they want to get as close as they possibly can, while those more virtuous persons would try to avoid getting close to the line out of fear of treading over, right? So a way to use people breaking the moral rule or the moral standard or the moral principle is to say, well, no, I've got an insight into that person. Now I'm going to possibly avoid interactions next time, or have a different kind of interaction, or what it is, right? So there's not really a problem with people breaking the moral rule. the point is that they're breaking the rule. As it is now, nobody even knows whether or not people are breaking moral rules, because there are no moral rules. It's only those with the guns who, who's always right. Huh?
I could do whatever, right? Tracheotomies, reviving an unconscious man, kicking in a window, taking a life jacket. These all fit under UPB, right? Because it's not a violation of property rights if permission is reasonable to expect afterwards. And where there's no choice, there really can't be morality, right? Really, and otherwise there's no difference between jumping off a cliff and being pushed off a cliff, right? Because, the choice is important. The initiation of force, the problem with it is it creates a situation of fundamental non-choice. You would not choose to have some guy with a gun to your head. To focus on the ethics of a man telling a falsehood to save his wife rather than the anarchic dude with a gun to his head is, to me, morally kind of bizarre. I mean, I think we really need to focus on the actual violence rather than the guy who's desperately trying to save his wife. Another thing that I wanted to mention, this is a bit of a development from the book itself, something I've been sort of thinking about since. It's an old Humean argument. You can't get an ought from an is. There's no fact of reality that produces an obligation.
It's incorrect. That's not what Hume says. And I state that in both a specific video I have made where I explain Hume's is-ought. He does not say that you can't get an ought from an is. What he basically says, if you do a deep dive and a correct interpretation, in my opinion, is that if you want to go from an is to an ought, you just have to explain how you do it. And of course, it has to be something that is, philosophically rigid and correct, right? That's all he says. He doesn't say you can't get an ought from an is, but he does not say that you can either. He just says you have to explain how. And it has to be a freaking good explanation, I would say, right?
And I would say, because you can't get an ought from an is, you are actually getting an ought from an is. And that sounds a bit trippy, but I'll sort of explain what I mean. So, oughts do not exist in reality. Therefore, we ought not to say that they do. Right? This is an example of UPB. It's the inescapability of it. If you can't get an ought from an is, you are getting an ought from an is. Or rather,
say what?
An ought from an is not, which is you ought not to say that they do, right? So immediately we have UPB. So an ought really comes from an is not. And I think mulling that over, I think, is really, really important.
No. You got that wrong.
And I think is really, really important.
I have to pause that. No, you misunderstand the terms. And I think that's one of the problems also in UPB in the book, as far as I remember now. What he says is, in his 740s way, right, is that people tend to make statements that has to do with how things are, right? And they go along a bit and say, this is how it is, and this is how it is. And then all of a sudden, they start to say, and therefore you ought to do this, and ought to do this, and ought to do this. By ought, he means they moralize. They are moralizing. It's not that he's only referring to those people who use the word ought. He's referring to people moralizing. They're describing the world, and just like as if they deduced from how the world is, they can state some kind of moral rule. That's what he's trying to say in that sort of quirky fashion. He's not saying you ought to do this or you ought to do that. He's not prescribing anything. You need to read this quote. It's very, very important. It's extremely important, right? It's possibly the most important insight in ethics ever. And it has to be very well understood what he says. And it has to be worked on. It has to be developed, right? It might not be, he might be wrong, actually, right? I mean, it has to be philosophically worked on, because it's such a sort of weird formulation, and it's sort of an afterthought of a long part of a book and so on, right? It's like, oh, and by the way, there's these situations where people do this and this and this and all, right? It's almost like an afterthought, right? And he should have wrote a whole book about it, so to say. Now, people would, it's called meta ethics now, right? But then it's gone completely overboard now. is completely, I mean, it's blown out of the water now, really, right? No, he's not telling you anything about what you ought. You could, I understand where you're going with it. I understand that he's saying you ought not jump from an is to an ought, but it's not really what he's talking about. It sounds like it's syllogistic, but he's just trying to say that people are describing the world and then jumping directly into saying, therefore you should, right? And he's using the term ought, because that's what implicit in these moral commandments. It's an ought commandment, right? But he is not saying that you can't get an ought from an is. He does not say that. You need to read it very carefully. He says that he finds it inconceivable, but that's not the same as saying it's impossible. It's like, it's in a, to make a comparison, it would be like saying, if Hume has said you can't get to the moon, it's impossible to go to the moon, right? No, he's saying, I have no idea how to get to the moon, but I can't rule out that you can go to the moon. I can't rule out either that you can't go to the moon, right? So he says, the only thing I want you to explain for me is, if you're going to the moon, just tell me how you do it, right? Okay.
And I mean, I sort of have an idea as to why people focus on these lifeboat scenarios, you know, to such a large degree. So, I mean, I have flagpoles and psycho killers and trams going down tracks, and you throw the switch here, there, or the other, or whatever. And compared to, like, I have an argument called, you know, taxation is the initiation of force against me. If you support taxation, then you support the use of violence against me, right? You're supporting people who want to use violence against me. You know, which moral situation is most prevalent in your life? People who support the state and the violence of taxation, or flagpoles and careening trams and psycho killers and lifeboat scenarios and so on? Well, I would obviously it's the latter, and that's where I think the ethics can really get some traction. And the purpose of the lifeboat scenarios, in a way, I think, is just to avoid talking about ethics in a much more immediate and practical way with the people around you in your life, which is obviously a very alarming, exciting, and scary thing to do. So I think that the lifeboat scenarios are kind of a distraction from that. It's sort of my opinion. And the book is free. I hope that you will check it out at freedomainradio.com.
Okay, I think this is it. It's just it's another recapitulation of what UPB is about, and a little extra bits and pieces here and there, right? So it's not really that big a thing, these two extra videos about UPB. There are a few call-in shows, some old ones. There's particularly one I want to comment on. I have done a very long comment on his UPB debate with rationality rules, a 4+ hour long comment, and an extra comment after he inserted a extra video piece into the first version of the video. So I made another hour of comments to that also. So that lies, some 8 or 9 months back. I'm not actually sure, but it was sometime last spring, I think. So that's it for now. Have a nice day.